WoW Killer is a production of amove.tv. Check out amove TV for many more podcasts, multiple about Blizzard games. And for more of Taliesin's WoW coverage, check out Taliesin and Evitel on YouTube and twitch.tv. Greetings and welcome back, everyone, to WoW Killer. I am Garrett, joined as always by Tally's chair, if you're watching the video.
Hello!
Oh! Not
Welcome
his chair.
to WoW Killer. I decided to do a really exciting intro, and if you're listening to this on the audio, you've just missed the best intro, the best entrance into the podcast that I've ever done, and it was brilliant. The fireworks didn't go off, but I did slide into frame like a creepy guy sliding into your DMs. And I'm here and I'm ready to WoW Kill.
God, that's just grosser than the grounded Maldraxxus. Ugh.
Oh, you made it about WoW. What are you doing?
I just want to, just
don't make it about WoW. Maldraxxus is my favorite zone. What a zone that is. I didn't think I was going to like Maldraxxus, but I love Maldraxxus very not much. I think it's great. Have you played it, Garrett?
The answer is always Edgelord. The answer is always Edgelord.
Have you played it?
Okay. I have treated it as I have treated every zone since Bastion, which is I go in, I walk around a little bit, go holy shit, this is amazing, and I immediately log out and I don't quest through it. I did some questing in Bastion, and other than that, I don't want to spoil things for myself, so I just take a look.
Very wise.
Yeah, I just go and take a look, get a bit of a feel, get a bit of a vibe.
Well, I'm going to give you some spoilers for it right now, Garrett, and you can't stop me because this is my podcast. There are skeletons in Maldraxxus.
Oh, yeah, it turns out.
And there's many skeletons, and there's much plaguey stuff, and you're in 80s metal album cover Nirvana there. I know Nirvana were 90s, but you know what I'm saying.
They were grunge, not really metal.
No,
and they were.
That's not the Nirvana I was talking about, Garrett. Nor was I talking about the 70s hippie band. I was talking about the literal Nirvana, of which Maldraxxus is the heavy metal of.
Listen. Once we get the zone of naked swimming babies, we can talk about Nirvana. But right now, we're talking about Iron Maiden because we're talking about Maldraxxus.
I don't think that came out quite as you meant it to, Garrett.
It came out exactly how I meant it to.
I mean, basically what you just said is that your dream... Is this the topic of today? Dream WoW zones. Garrett's is one full of naked swimming babies.
I mean, it was more...
At last! The naked swimming baby zone! Where did I put my dollar bill?
On a hook, clearly. On a hook, Taliesin.
I would like to make it very clear at this point because Garrett's views on wanting the naked swimming baby zone in WoW do not represent those of the WoW Killer podcast or its many other contributors. And that's Garrett's thing. That's what he wants. And it's fine. I guess it would be good. I mean, right, okay, so elves.
I'm just going to apologize up front because had I gone with the In Utero album cover art, it actually would have worked rather nicely with Maldraxxus. So I apologize to all of my World of Warcraft / Nirvana fans for not going with the album cover art that could have actually kept this going and not made it weird.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, like, just be glad that Maldraxxus turned out to be like the 80s metal album cover zone and not, as you might have expected from Blizzard, frankly, to be like the mid to late 90s new rap metal zone, because that wouldn't have been as good.
Yeah, and new metal's like kind of coming back right now, but we're not here to talk music.
No?
It is.
Really?
It's making a bit of a comeback.
I was pretty convinced that would be something that would never, ever come back. Why? How is it coming back? Give me an example of how new
because honestly, Taliesin, I can't think of a better song to play from your doof wagon as you drive into the Mad Max apocalypse than Break Stuff by Limp Bizkit. I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense. But
no, you always play Duel of the Fates when you drive fast. Duel of the Fates is driving fast song.
I mean,
like if you're like, I need to drive, and if you know those cameras they put on F1 drivers, and like so you can see from their point of view, and they're driving like that. They have to dub in separate sound because
are you trying to describe a GoPro without saying GoPro? Are you?
Yeah. All of that. Well, I mean, those point of view cameras have existed since long before pros, man. Like, you know. But I'm just saying, if they use the actual sound, every single F1 driver is always just listening to Duel of the Fates all the time, except the ones that don't win, obviously. All the ones that win are always listening to Duel of the Fates, because that makes you drive faster. It's as simple as that. Please don't tell me nu metal is coming back. No one wants that. No one. And when you say nu metal is coming back, Garrett, do you mean that the various members of Korn did like a stream of them doing a live version of Word Up or whatever? And that's like nu metal is back now. I love
that Word Up is where you go with Korn.
Yeah, because like that is when nu metal. I feel like nu metal jumped the shark numerous times, but that was definitely one time when nu metal was just
nu metal. Nu metal is the soundtrack for shark jumping.
Pretty much. Yeah. And like, you know, nu metal had already jumped the shark at that point, but Korn's Word Up made it a kind of a Demon Hunter style double jump. Like they hadn't actually come down from the jump at that point. They were still above the shark. The jump had happened, and they just made it a double jump with Word Up. And I appreciate that.
It's bad gaming.
Word Up.
Bad gaming.
Korn
were
in an episode of who was that? What was that cop show? Which had like that guy in it who was kind of like, he was very, he had like anxiety and stuff. And he was like, it was like an American like detective show. Oh, what was it? Was it Castle?
Monk?
I can't remember. But they were in an episode of that. Korn were in an episode of that, and they played Word Up. And it was that thing that always happens when
wasn't aware of this
in a TV show, and it was like, oh my god, it's Korn for some reason. Monk. It was Monk. Thank you, not Castle. It was Monk. Yeah, it was Monk. And Korn were an episode of Monk.
You are.
Please don't watch it.
Listen, as someone who thought was the keeper of nu metal lore on this show, you have just styled on me. So I pass the backwards Red Yankees hat to you.
Thank you.
All yours.
Don't mind if I do.
Enjoy that. Yeah, man. So
that's Maldraxxus. That's our review of Maldraxxus. 10 out of 10 with nu metal again.
Yes, exactly. Would Are You Ready followed by whatever the weird thing that Jonathan
Word Up, guys. Maldraxxus is awesome.
It's good stuff. Bring it back, folks. Bring it back. We are here to talk about borrowed power. That's going to be our topic for today. I have no way to segue into that from nu metal. I guess you could say that nu metal acts borrowed power from both metal and rap, and did not use it wisely.
Okay, I'd like you to explain today's topic for me, please, Garrett.
It was inspired
about 5 seconds before we started this podcast, and I think that's great. That's how I like some topics to go sometimes. I like them to be a bit off the cuff and things like that. But what do you mean exactly?
Well, I mean by this was inspired by, and when I say inspired by, I mean entirely lifted from an emailer who goes simply by the name Sheep, who wrote in and said, with Shadowlands incoming and the Covenants more and more in place, the term borrowed power is being thrown around a lot. What kinds of borrowed power systems do you think have been handled the best and the worst? Do you like this direction, or do you think classes should be a more complete package from CAP? Personally, it surprises me that this is being discussed as if it's new with Legion. Sheep is referencing, of course, artifact weapons here. And then continues to say, although the layer kick issue is especially noticeable recently, tier sets are very clearly an OG example of borrowed power. I'd love to see an episode with your takes. Well, you're going to get it, Sheep. You're going to get it right now. So yeah, I mean, it seems much more on the nose and much more prominent with things like Legion, because they were the artifact weapons were, I mean, not inherently endgame, because we did get them basically from the get-go in Legion, but they were kind of the end game progression to a certain degree, right?
Artifacts. I mean, I'd say artifacts took up more than just end game progression. I would say they were a major tentpole of the entire expansion, including the leveling. From 100 to 110. of the leveling process as well. The artifact storylines made up like a huge chunk of your like starting Legion experience, as in, you know, starting in the content itself. So not starting a level 1 character, obviously, but, you know, once you enter the Legion content, artifacts were prominent. They were there. You couldn't progress without getting your artifact and then your class hall, which you couldn't do until you got your artifact. Like, there was literally no way to play Legion without an artifact. So I think it did form a major part of Endgame, although maybe not as much as its BFA versions did. But it was more than that. It was a central tenet to the entire expansion. Is there an example of borrowed power in WoW beyond tier sets before that?
I don't.
I know tier sets is like the obvious example that you fall back onto when you're talking about power. And I think there are very important differences, which we'll talk about for sure, which means it's not a totally apt comparison. But is there anything else that can even slightly compare to the borrowed power of artifacts?
I don't think so.
I think so either. People are saying heirlooms in the chat, legendary cloak. I mean, what we're talking about there, okay, so the legendary cloak was just a really good bit of gear. It wasn't so much a progression system. Like, it was a long quest line that you had to go through, and it's a quest line that kind of spanned a huge chunk of the expansion. But and I guess you did get sort of not so good versions of it. And same with the legendary ring in Warlords of Draenor. You got not so good versions of it that you then replaced with a slightly better version of.
That's why I kind of recoil away from that, because then all gear is borrowed power.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing. If you want to take this conversation to a ridiculous kind of extreme, then if you take one part of the argument, which says WoW and MMOs in general shouldn't have like borrowed power elements because everything should be in place in a spec and a rotation and the way a spec works without the borrowed power, then if you take that argument to its stupid extreme and be quite obnoxious about it, then you're saying, well, then in that case, like, gear should not exist. And like, you shouldn't be able to improve your performance or your power by sort of upgrading and getting better things. And then you've lost the entire point of an MMO, essentially. Now, that's like obviously being facetious, and that's obviously kind of making a point. But the fact is that gear is not borrowed. You know, if you never got better gear than the gear you're wearing, you would keep that gear on forever. The only reason you ever replace gear is because you get better gear, not because that gear stopped working. Like, if you have a level 60 helm and like you replace it with a 61 helm, that 60 helm wasn't borrowed. It doesn't stop working in the next expansion. It's just been replaced by better things. Whereas the artifacts literally stopped working. The power that they had was removed. They didn't work. They were grayed out. And the same thing will happen with essences and with azerite armor and with the 8.3 thing. That will happen as well. Like, the power will
entirely, though. I mean, because there is a gray area there. They took certain abilities from artifacts and just made them or abilities or talents in BFA.
Oh, sure.
Like, things have lived on, which I like. I don't like arbitrary rules. If something works and it's fun, let's keep it around.
Like a legacy of like a past system.
Yeah,
but it's not like the power of the artifact still being relevant or useful, because that was literally taken away from it. You know, it was, and yeah, okay. So some of like the effects that worked really well with the spec, and legendary effects as well. Like, is a legendary borrowed power? Is a Legion legendary borrowed power? Is a trinket borrowed power?
To me, I think if it manipulates or alters your in-game abilities or the way that your class plays in a way outside of stats, Like, I think I draw the line at stats. I think you have to draw a line somewhere, and I think stats are where I draw it, because stats are something that are just ever increasing or improving in quality, even beyond statistical squishes that have happened over the history of this game, right? So, yeah, I look at ability altering or ability granting through gear or in-game systems that then are taken away. That's what I look at as borrowed power. So yeah, if a legendary altered your ability or gave you an ability you wouldn't otherwise have, that then you no longer had the second you stopped using that legendary or replaced it, yeah, I would call that borrowed power.
So replacing it counts as borrowed, even though you could still wear it and have that power.
Yeah,
because it's your choice to replace it. It's not been taken away from you by Blizzard, is what I'm saying. Like, I can't use artifact abilities now. They are gone. They are taken out of the game. They were borrowed. But if I've got an old trinket, I can put that trinket on, and I still get the effect from that trinket. So
but
it's
are
not
you
borrowed.
severely hampering? Well, it's I don't know, because that's where it gets muddy, right? Because it's tied to a piece of statistic enhancing gear as well. So you can't really, if you actually want to play the game remotely well, you can't do that. You have to get rid of it.
Oh yeah, for sure. But what I'm saying is, like, I don't see how that was borrowed in that case. Like, I had shoes when I was a kid that don't fit anymore because I grew out of them and I replaced them with new shoes. Like, I wouldn't describe those shoes as being borrowed. And like I just replaced them with things that fitted me better when I got bigger. There were stuff that I did borrow off people and I had to give back. For me, like, having to give something back again is like the definition of something that is borrowed over something that is replaced. And like, I never gave back the artifact. It was taken from me. Whereas I have kind of in like, I
mean, was it?
So what am I? Sorry, that's wrong. I had to give back the artifact. I couldn't keep the artifact with all the power that I'd put into it. That all became irrelevant. I had to give it back. Whereas trinkets and tier sets as well, I don't give back. I've still got them. I just don't use them anymore. For many reasons, the main one of which is like they're far too low item level. Yeah.
I see where you're getting at. It's just that I find, like, at its core, to me, the reason I notice not having the artifacts around are for the ways it altered my abilities, or the abilities it granted me that I no longer have access to. The stat stick it's attached to is a little pointless. I realize it's a big lore point, but I guess when I see the conversation that's being had around borrowed power, it's more just as a game system or mechanic design, which is why I would tie it. If I'm tying, I guess because I think I agree with Sheep here, who wrote this email in, and in that I do kind of look at tier sets, and more specifically the tier bonuses attached to them, as a older form of borrowed power. And if I think that's the case, I think I would say the same is true of legendaries.
Yeah. Even though legendaries were just grayed out again once you got to like level 115.
Right.
Which, by the way, didn't happen to legendaries before. Like, I can still use legendaries that you picked up in previous expansions, and they will mostly still work and have their effects sort of still working, whereas that won't happen with Legion legendaries. Those have been specifically, the power has been drained from them. They've been taken away, and they just don't work anymore. Now they are literally just stat sticks. Like, the borrowed power we're talking about isn't even the power. Like, the power isn't even there anymore.
Right. It's honestly, the same is true for tier sets.
Yeah, I mean, tier sets is difficult because they are. So when we talk about tier sets, just for someone who's never played World of Warcraft before, the main reward for me throughout World of Warcraft raiding has always been tier sets, and the idea that you build up a set of armor which has synergy with itself, so that it has a bonus that it gives you when you get to 2 pieces of the set, and it has a bonus which it gives you when you get to 4 pieces of the set. And those bonuses are specifically catered to your class, and they will affect, hopefully, something interesting in your rotation for that specific class or spec, which is very important. Like, and it's that kind of rotation altering power which was incredibly enticing and important about tier sets. So, and because they're so closely tied to the rotation of a spec at that moment in time, quite often in following expansions, the bonus they give you literally doesn't even make sense, because they might refer to a spell or ability that's been taken out of the game or works in a completely different way. And so the bonus they give you just isn't relevant anymore, and just doesn't kind of fit in with that. So that's why tier sets are grayed out. But quite right, they are grayed out. And the thing is, the tier sets are replaced even within the expansion, you know. But even within the expansion, you know, there's that thing where, again, really the only reason you're replacing a one tier set from one tier with a tier set from another tier is because of the item level and relative stat power of the new tier set you're getting. And you can even see with if a spec, say in Legion, had which was the most recent example we have of tier sets, if a spec had a particularly good tier set bonus in one raid, they would do everything they could to maintain that tier set bonus deep into the next raid, despite the fact that they were using statistically suboptimal gear, and like gear which was like a whole tier behind the current gear in the current raid that they were picking up in terms of item level, because that power, because that synergy with their abilities was so good. And like how bad it felt to leave that tier set bonus behind when they had no choice but to do that. And you know, the trick was always to end up with a 6 set bonus anyway. So you try and keep your best 2 set bonus and a 4 set bonus from the new raid as well. So like you can have yourself the kind of fabled 6 set bonus, and you would do that at the expense of item level and of statistical power. That's how important those powers were for a lot of specs. And that was very much borrowed, and it always felt bad when you had to leave behind a really, really good tier set bonus. So does borrowed power in the long run feel, because like, you know, the advantages of borrowed power in the short term are obvious, okay? Feels really good to just get given something really cool, or to earn something really cool, which does something great. But I mean, you can't just keep adding to power, right? So
right.
you
I
have
mean,
to
that is the
some kind of a soft reset at some point.
Yeah, I mean that is the inherent challenge with an MMO that they're trying to combat. That's where borrowed power comes in, right? We're getting a massive update, cleaning up of the leveling process in Shadowlands that the game is kind of honestly very much due for that reason, because there's this really like asymmetrical leveling experience right now in World of Warcraft, where levels seem kind of arbitrary because you don't get something at every level, so on and so forth. But like that, like going all the way back to like OG vanilla World of Warcraft, that was a bit of an issue, right? Like, where do you go when BC hits? Well, like, what do you do? What do you design for the system? You add more, you know, they started adding more talents, but at a certain point, they clearly asked the question I think a lot of us were thinking was like, do we just keep adding talent? Can we do that? Is this getting ridiculous? And obviously it seemed like Blizzard came to the agreement that, yeah, it's ridiculous. We can't just keep doing this. We need to do something different. We need to consolidate, which they started doing. But then, the reason why I think we're focusing on Legion so much is that the artifact system was so different at the time. It was basically adding like a second talent tree to your class. Hell, to your spec, because there was an artifact weapon per spec.
And it's worth noting that obviously that kind of feeling of I think it's okay to call it borrowed power. That was even more so in BFA. And it's one of the reasons it's become a major criticism of that expansion. But it's worth noticing it's going to be a whole lot of it in Shadowlands as well. Like, you have the Covenant abilities, which are 2 abilities depending on which change depending on the Covenant that you choose. And in some cases they are like, rotation heavy, like they're going to feature very heavily in your rotation. Sometimes they're like a big cooldown that you're going to get very used to using, something like that. The base abilities, in particular for Venthyr and Ardenweald and Necrolords as well, are ones that you will use an awful lot, and you will get used to using them, and you'll get used to those benefits that come with them. And that's going to last the entire expansion. But then you've also got Soulbinds and Conduits as well, which are 3 separate talent trees with some major abilities in them as well. If you look at the Ardenweald Soulbinds, which were data mined a while ago, there are full on like gold artifact trait level sort of things that you hit in there, things that will like, you know, do things like it increases your healing and spreads out your overhealing between other targets and things like that, like major powers that are going to affect the way you play and the way your character works. It could be said that all of these things are essentially trinkets, right? They're all essentially tier set bonuses or trinkets, and they will disappear, just like trinkets and tier sets do. So why is it so much worse? And this is a rhetorical question. I'm not like trying to defend it or anything, but why is it so much worse when it's azerite armor or essences or artifact weapons or soulbinds and conduits? Why is that so much worse than tier set bonuses or trinkets, which we all agree we love, Garrett?
I don't know. I don't have a.
But I mean, would you agree that it does feel worse?
I mean, I think in BFA it does. I think obviously, I think the popular opinion that I agree with is that legendary weapons or artifact weapons were awesome. They were fun as hell. I loved Legion. For the most part, I had alt grumbles down the road, much the same way I do with BFA. But I think to a certain degree, and I think this might be unpopular, but my belief is that it was just there from the beginning and we were used to it. I think that holds a bit of weight. This is just the way it's always been. You know, there have been item slots for trinkets since the dawn of World of Warcraft. But I'll say why I lean towards liking it, which is there's just a variety. Like, yes, it does feel bad when I have to say goodbye to a trinket or a tier bonus that I rather enjoyed. But personally, I liked when a new tier of gear would hit, and just like, oh, what are the bonuses this time? You know, what trinkets are there? We still get it with trinkets, but I like that it wasn't tied to an expansion spanning arc of this is the theme or the direction that this quote unquote borrowed power system is leaning towards, and if you're not into it, sorry. Like, I like that things could shake things up mid expansion with things like tier bonuses and whatnot, and they've obviously have tried in BFA with things like essences and whatnot. But I don't really know. I've never really thought about why I still prefer gearing to things like essences, because I hate them, clearly. I really don't like essences.
Do you know what I think it is? I think in the example you've just given, tier sets are, as we just said, very specific to a spec. You know, the ability changed was designed with a spec in mind, and the effect that they had was designed with the rotation of that spec in mind as it existed at the time. Whereas essences and trinkets as well, but essences and azerite power and covenant abilities as well are much more broad. So they're not designed with a specific spec in mind. They're not designed to synergize with one specific like rotation and find a really interesting place in that one rotation. They're broad. They're like anyone can use like the Ardenweald base ability. And yeah, you're right. If you're a druid, you'll get a different Ardenweald like other second ability than a warlock will. But still, there's like almost like a lack of bespokeness about those powers.
That's true of trinkets.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I lump trinkets in with that as well. And someone said that one of the reasons that artifacts, for example, felt worse than tier sets was because the amount of like effort and investment that you put into it throughout the expansion. And I think that's probably true overall. However, if I take the first tier of Legion as an example, the first 2 tiers of Legion as an example, actually, my artifact progression was something that happened very naturally and something I didn't have to really put much effort into. I knew that I had to do my emissaries when they popped, and I wanted to do my emissaries because, do you remember when daily quests first happened in Legion and they were really fun? Because they were so new. And like the whole emissary system was just really, really good. And it was like, everyone like really enjoyed doing these emissaries. It's fantastic. And so, my artifact progression was something that happened at a very steady rate without me really having to focus on it too much. So I unlocked all of those traits, and I always knew that I was going to unlock them. Those traits were there. They were grayed out, waiting for me to get the requisite amount of artifact power to unlock them. But I was always going to unlock them. And like, it was just a case of when I would have access to that ability, like that gold ability or something like that. In the first tier, there was like the slight added choice of like, which route do I take unlocking the various parts of my artifact? But you knew that you would unlock everything like by the time the first raid ended. Do you know what I mean? Like that was just something that was going to happen before the first raid even started if you were in a world first guild. And so yeah, it was a personal investment into the artifact that went all through the expansion. But did I work as hard to unlock everything on my artifact weapon as I did to get the 7th spine trinket in 8.1? Nowhere near. Did I have to jump into like Mythic Plus 8 to 10 times a day, and specifically that the Blackrook Hold, and run Blackrook Hold 9 or 10 times a day to try and get like not just the 7th spine trinket, but 7th spine trinket at a good item level, as higher item level as I could possibly get from Mythic Plus? Like, no, obviously not. I was just playing the game normally, and that's how I invested into my artifact weapon. I didn't have any choices to make. There was a soft cap on how quickly I could even progress my artifact weapon. So yeah, I did invest in it, and I did put effort into it, but nowhere near as much effort as I put into getting one specific trinket, which I then ended up using for about a month and a half before Discipline Priest didn't need mana so much, and I didn't really need 7th spine trinket anymore. And I replaced it with something else that did more HPS.
I'm trying to think of why I like that bet. I'm so much more personally and obviously we've talked on the show. As we've talked on the show, everyone listening, you've probably come to the realization that I really like running dungeons, but also raids. But I'm trying my best to remove my personal biases from this conversation, and I'm trying to think of like, why am I responding to your trinket more than I am your progression through the artifact? Is it because even if like just a piece of gear is, where it's located, where it has the potential of dropping, whether it's a dungeon boss, a raid boss, irrelevant, doesn't matter. You have a goal. You know where it drops. You know what you need to do. And there's a chance that you're not going to get it. And is it because just through the system of how drops and gear work in this game, and yes, the systems have changed somewhat over time, but there's always something on a specific boss that you need, right? And you're going to chase that, and at some point we're all going to replay that content over and over, and we're all going to have varying degrees of stories of how long it took us to get that thing. And is that seemingly basic concept of how World of Warcraft functions, does that just become inherently more personal than artifact power grinding or azerite grinding, which is something that literally every single player in the game is going through, and it just doesn't feel that different from class to class? Whereas if I'm chasing a certain trinket on my paladin, it's probably not the same trinket that you're chasing on your priest.
Maybe. I think the argument of it being more personal is actually, I think people who are arguing against the idea of borrowed power are actually arguing the opposite. I think they're saying like, it feels like with Azerite armor, you're investing so much more into it over the course of an expansion than, for example, farming a tier set or farming a trinket. And this idea that, I don't think it was such an option, a problem with artifact weapons, but when it comes to Azerite armor, look at the rings of Azerite armor. You've got 3 pieces of armor. Each piece of armor has 4 rings, 4 different abilities on it. And some of those is going to be the same abilities that stack for sure. But, that's 12 abilities that like major power upgrades that you've got just in those 3 pieces of gear alone. Then you've got the 2 trinkets, fine. Then you've got your essences, and now we have 4 essences equipped at any one time. The minor ones have 1 effect, and your major one has 2 effects. So that's 5 other abilities there as well. On top of the 12 that you have from your Azerite power, that's 17 abilities. That's some quick maths. Don't be impressed. I've written it all down. I haven't. I just made that. I did it on the fly. It's fine. I'm very clever. And then you've got your corruptions as well. Okay, now you can have corruption on potentially every single piece of gear. And like those are, again, major effects. Now, if you do have corruption on every single piece of gear, chances are you are stacking one particular effect. So let's even if it is just 1 effect that you're getting from the corruption, that's still 18 borrowed abilities that are then going to disappear. And those are major things. And those are things that certainly when it comes to the essences and the corruption, kind of transcends gear changing in a way. And you'd argue that actually the Azerite rings do as well, because like the entire sort of one of the major failings of Azerite armor is that it never felt like you were actually replacing your gear from tier to tier in the same way that you replace like a trinket or whatever, or a tier set, because you'd replace a tier set and you get a whole new power to use. With Azerite armor, you were essentially trying to get the exact same abilities again, but on like a different piece of armor and at a higher item level. So that's one of the reasons it felt so rubbish, was because it's like, okay, so I've got to find the piece of Azerite armor in the new raid, which has the exact same abilities on it as the piece I'm wearing right now, and I'm going to get it, and there'll be maybe a ring or 2 that I haven't unlocked. So I'll actually have less abilities, but they'll be the same abilities, but then I'll work hard to unlock the abilities, and then I'll be at the stage I am now, where I have these exact same abilities again.
Yeah. And that's something we've come back around to so many times on the show. And I think if we're having this conversation about borrowed power, it's like kind of the penultimate discussion of what you just brought up. And it's like, I don't personally have very strong memories of a tier bonus that just blew my mind. But I've also class hopped like a jackass. When I like tiers that I remember very fondly, it's really just more about what they look like, and what I like, what my investment in World of Warcraft at the time was. That's me personally. But I think a lot of people do have very strong memories of tier set bonuses that they loved. And you can probably remember ones you didn't like as well. But I don't think that like inherently discredits that system. But like what you're describing, which is, I think, one of the biggest, if probably for me, I think what you just described is the biggest inherent issue with Azerite armor, right? Is that it's just this, you get a new piece of armor and it just doesn't feel special, because you either A, have everything you just had, or B, have to work again to get the stuff you just had. So yes, with tier sets, like from bonus to bonus, there was the chance that you were going to like the new bonuses as much as the old bonuses, but at least there was a sense of individuality and a sense of uniqueness as you progress through the gearing tiers of an expansion.
Don't forget how bad it felt though when the tier set bonuses from a new raid were just not as good as the tier set bonuses that you'd grown to love from the current raid. Like when you saw those tier set bonuses pop up for the new raid, and you looked up the one for your class or your spec or whatever, and you were like, oh man, this one sucks. I mean, this one is a major DPS or healing loss for me. Why can't I just keep this cool ability that I have? Why can't we bake this in or something like that? So I mean, that element of having to give that power back and it being borrowed, granted, more because you had no real choice but to move on to the current tier gear, because very few abilities were worth hanging on to old tier set gear. But it would happen for 1 or 2 specs every single tier. There'd always be 1 or 2 specs that would be hanging on to their old tier gear, because it was literally like a DPS increase on the new stuff.
Yeah,
which feels weird.
It's weird, but I think it's cool.
Yeah, I think it's cool as well.
I like.
What I'm saying, there are lots of complaints about it.
I understand that, but I think it is. I like when things aren't so damn cut and dry with gearing, and yet at the same time, I love having a gearing shopping list of knowing exactly what bosses I need to just grind and kill until I check off all the gear I need.
Except you hate essences.
I do.
Which is like a very much a gearing shopping list.
Except they make me go do things I have no interest in doing to get gear to go do things I am interested in doing in some cases.
Sure. It's not the shopping list that you love. It's a specific type of shopping list that you like.
I may have liked essences better if they were like, well, azerite armor is dead and we're replacing it with essences, as opposed to bolting on yet another obtuse piece of system to a broken system. I feel like they should have just replaced azerite armor for sure. I agree. I probably would have liked them a lot better, but the fact that I still had to deal with that crap, I'm just like, what?
They should have not just replaced it, but they should have had a whole quest chain in 8.2 where you symbolically, like, you go to Kultiris or whatever, and
hi everybody, we're building an effigy to azerite armor, and we're going to light it.
Is on like a cliff, and you literally throw your azerite armor into the sea. Like she encases it in ice and concrete, and then you throw it in the sea, and you go, "Get in the sea." I think that would have been just really nice.
Yeah.
And then she said, "Here's your lovely necklace with some essences. Go wild." And be like, "Thanks, Jane. I love you. Bye."
But a massive portion of my dislike for essences is a personal annoyance. It's like a lack of patience running out. And so, yeah. But back, where the hell was I going with this?
I'm really sorry. I talked about the sea, and I know how talking about the sea makes you wistful for your childhood. I'm sorry. It's a distraction. I'm sorry.
I'm coming to personal terms with probably not visiting an island town I like going to every summer.
I'm so sorry. I feel exactly the same. I'm not going to see my folks in Swansea this summer, and like seeing my folks in Swansea is like the best thing. And just breathing some sea air and walking on the front and seeing ships and boats and. I'm
thinking of wild chickens in Key West and the sound of distant drunk tourists.
Got to be careful about chickens.
Yeah.
Got to be very careful. I told you about Jake, didn't I? My brother's friend. Did I ever tell you about Jake?
I'm hesitant to say yes so that we go deeper down the rabbit hole, but no, you haven't.
My brother had a friend called Jake. Oh, sorry, Jake. I should have changed the name. In fact, I did change the name. His name's not really Jake. Anyway, we'll call him Jake. Had some family in India and used to go and stay with them in the summer. And when Jake was like 5 or 6 years old, Jake was running around the family farm with his willy out because he was like 5 or 6 years old, and that's what happens sometimes. You'll see down the beach as well, toddlers and stuff running around with their willies out. And at the farm, a chicken went, "Ooh, I'll have a bit of that," and bit the end off his willy. Pecked the end off his willy. Sorry, I should have said that properly. And Jake apparently to this day has like a flattened end of his willy because a chicken pecked it off.
Wow, that is
so. All I'm
terrifying.
saying is, I haven't seen it, but my brother's seen it and can confirm is true.
Listen, I really appreciate that extremely unorthodox guerrilla advertisement for the Angry Chicken podcast. Thank you.
The ravenous chicken.
the dick hungry chicken.
Not safe for work.
Listeners,
please call your podcast the Dick Hungry Chicken. Please, can we call this podcast the Dick Hungry Chicken? Because then you would be on the Hungry Chicken and the Dick Hungry Chicken. And people would genuinely be able to introduce you as Garrett from the Hungry Chicken and the Dick Hungry Chicken.
Boy, this got so NSFW so fast. Well, yeah. Listeners at home, by the way, please tweet at me and keep me honest and make me come up with a random segue bumper that we can play when shit like this goes down. I feel like we need some really bad sideshow music in the background.
What episode of the Dick Hungry Chicken is this even? I don't even know. How long have we been doing this podcast now?
19.
19. One of the reasons WoW is such a successful game is because it finds subtle ways to reinvent itself and change its focus and mix up the meta and things like that. And I feel like that's exactly what we're doing by renaming this podcast the Dick Hungry Chicken. A name which, for some reason, I find incredibly difficult to say.
DHC. Welcome to DHC episode 19, everybody.
It's quite the mouthful.
It's wonderful.
The Dick Hungry Chicken.
It's quite the beakful, I think you mean. Boy.
Oh, word up. Right. I mean,
We're gonna play
anyway,
some corn in the background.
Yeah. And actually, me bringing up the subtle changes and changes of the meta and things like that is an important part of this, okay? Because this is what, I mean, you've got to ask yourself, okay, so we've kind of established what borrowed power is. We've established the things that we don't like about it. And especially when it comes to like expansion-wide versions. And, I think a lot of people, they have a feeling where even if those abilities are then baked into a spec, which they quite often are, they still feel like it's a kind of borrowed power because, of course, every expansion, when you start the new expansion, you are left with that thing where a whole ton of your power disappears. And they tried to get around that in BFA by having your Legion legendaries still work up until level 115. So they were like, to try and combat this feeling of starting a new expansion and you losing all of this borrowed power, particular power, we're going to let you borrow it for a little bit longer. And it's going to last you until halfway through your leveling. Actually felt even worse. Would have been better if they hadn't done that in hindsight.
It's a new expansion. Just rip the Band-Aid off.
Exactly. And maybe this is why I'm not incredibly qualified to talk about this particular topic, is because I differ from a sizable proportion of the WoW player base, and yet I suspect not the majority of the WoW player base, in that I actually really like losing all my power at the beginning of the expansion. For me, that's like one of the exciting things about a new expansion, and I wouldn't want it any other way.
I mean, I don't think it's an inherently bad thing either. So maybe we're both shouldn't be having this conversation, but there's enough conversations against it out there being had. Like at the end of the day, this is a video game, and there are design challenges. Like It's something that WoW has struggled with since the very beginning, from going to expansion, and I kind of already touched on this, which is like, what do you do? Do you just keep adding new talent tiers? You really can't. It just becomes too absurd and bloated. Or you start adding tiers that are kind of pointless, like stat increasing levels, just because you've run out of unique ideas for new abilities or ability augmentation. And so I don't. The challenge is what we arrived at, right? I think the at its worst, and I'm speaking in generalizations here, you end up with BFA. You go from Legion to BFA, which I think is actually kind of analogous to the conversation we just had about tier gear, like the issue, the risk with tier. With tier bonuses going from one tier to the next is that it's not as good, or it's not an improvement over the previous tier bonus, or B, you don't like it as much, even if it is a statistically better way to gear your character. Well, if we look at the artifact system in Legion, most of us liked it because it is considered by most to be a successful system that everybody liked. You go to BFA, you throw it away, and you bring in a new system that replaces it that we don't like as much. And so you kind of have, in one way, I think that's very similar to the risk with tier set bonuses. It's just that now it's the risk from expansion to expansion instead of from set to set.
Do you know what, Garrett? I think that's a very eloquent point, and it's made me think about it differently. And I think you're right. I think, for all we talk about, like the borrowed power, feeling bad when you have to kind of give it back or whatever, I don't think people generally did feel like that going from Legion into BFA. That was a big worry all the way through Legion, was this thing of like, oh, okay, the artifact is really fun now, but what's it going to feel like when we have to lose all of this going into next? How's that going to feel? And actually didn't feel that bad. Now, it combined with the usual like beginning of the expansion thing of like, oh, now I have no haste, now I have no crit, and things like that. Combined with that, it certainly contributed to that bad feeling of feeling underpowered at the beginning of the expansion, which, by the way, I don't mind at the beginning of expansion, because one of the reasons I like MMOs and RPGs is because I like building that power and getting more powerful. I don't want to end up in a situation where, because we never take anything away, 3 or 4 expansions down the line, I start off uber powerful and I just get even more uber powerful as the expansion goes on. Like, I don't mind feeling a bit underpowered at the beginning of the expansion. And I don't mind being at, say, level 119 and feeling all right with everything, and then suddenly hitting max level and everything feeling much harder. I don't mind that either, because I kind of feel like things should get harder when you get to max level, because you're at max level now and everything's really hard. And that's a criticism I've never really agreed with either. The idea that, the enemies will hit harder when you get to max level than they did the level below. It's like, yeah. Yeah, they do. Like they do in every video game.
It is a
when you
video
get
game.
End level,
right.
The baddies are bigger and harder, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, okay, I get that they were the same baddies that you could have fought at like 119 and they would have been much easier, and then suddenly some arbitrary number ticks and they become harder. I get that. But when it comes down to the brass tacks of it, yeah, I want the game to be harder at max level than it is at like the level below max level. That's literally what I want.
There's a whole lot of agreement going on in this episode.
Yeah. So I don't think actually losing the artifact weapons was. I don't think when you get down to it, I don't think that's what made people feel bad. I think you're right. I think the system that replaced it was so bad and so frustrating and so unsatisfying that it made people reassess the idea of borrowed power. Because like we've kind of talked about, borrowed power has been a central tenet to like I was about to say Warhammer then, to Warcraft, like, through tier sets and what have you, and through trinket effects and legendary effects as well throughout the game. Less noticeable than in Legion and certainly BFA, but they were there. And so I think the problem really was, and the reason that we're even talking about this now, because it has become such a buzz topic, like this thing of borrowed power equals bad. What you mean is borrowed power in BFA equals bad. Like, and in the same way where RNG equals bad. It's like, no, the bad examples of RNG in BFA equals bad. Like, RNG in itself isn't bad. Like, you want a bit of RNG in your rotation. Like, RNG shouldn't automatically be a dirty word. You want some RNG in your gearing and your loot drops and things like that. Like, otherwise you'd all get the gear that you wanted the first time you killed the boss, or you'd go into it knowing I have to kill this boss 8 times and then I'll get my piece of gear. And like, that's not good. You want some level of RNG in all these things. So like, when we say borrowed power equals bad, RNG equals bad, like these things equal bad that have become such topics, what we mean is, in the last expansion, this thing, borrowed power, RNG, whatever, hasn't been utilized in a satisfactory way. These are important parts of the game. They're important parts of like the design of the game and the mechanics of the game. But in this particular instance, they haven't been utilized properly. And I think that would definitely be the case in BFA. I think like the feeling of the borrowed power in BFA was much more noticeable, particularly when it came to like corruption and essences and things like that, which is why it's become such a hot topic. But I don't know. I think when it's done right, it's okay. And personally,
yeah, I agree. It's just that the risk of player dissatisfaction if you get it wrong because it's tied to an expansion arcing system it's great. It's a great risk. And that's what we saw in BFA was an expansion arcing system that didn't land. Mm-hmm. And they've tried to fix it, and it just hasn't really worked. So yeah, it's I don't know. I'm just a little tiny bit uncomfortable saying like it's just like you're just saying that the most recent or the previous expansion's version of it was bad, because it's like there's so many other bits. I mean, folks in chat were bringing up taking certain things away and giving them back in follow-up expansions, either tied to something like an azerite system or whatnot. And they're not they're not wrong, but there's also, I don't know, it's not always, I don't think that every instance of that is necessarily because of borrowed power. I think it might have just been the devs trying something, or because of consolidation or pruning.
So I think that's important as well. And I think when people are talking about why borrowed power is bad, I think they're actually, a lot of the time, without even realizing it, actually talking about a different issue, which comes through noticeably in the use of borrowed power, but isn't actually the problem with borrowed power. It's a problem with something else. And that is when these artifact abilities or essences or tier sets or trinkets and the abilities you get from them, which are temporary, whether they be tier wide or expansion wide, the problem comes when those abilities fill a gap in the mechanics and rotation of a spec. So if a spec is very specifically lacking a certain depth, certain utility, and which is very important, like a spec is literally bad without this ability. And so this ability is introduced in the form of a trinket or in the form of an artifact power, or in this form of an essence. When that hole in a spec is filled by a power that isn't permanent and will get replaced by something else, that's a problem. But that's not a borrowed power problem. That's a class design problem. And so like people blame that on borrowed power, but that's not. That's a class design problem. The borrowed power thing is solving the problem, but it's not what caused the problem. And the fact that because it's borrowed power, it then gets taken away, and you're left with the same hole in your spec that you had before, and the same hole in your rotation that you had before. And there was the sense, granted, that in BFA, specs were designed specifically with those holes in them. Or if they had those holes in them, there was a sense that maybe the developers were saying, well, you know what? We can fill that hole with azerite power. We can, later on, maybe we can fill that hole with essences, when really they should have been filling those holes. Like those holes shouldn't have been there in the class design in the first place, and the borrowed power that you get from azerite armor or from trinkets or from tier sets should be an addition which just really spices up like the spec and things like that. And that's not a borrowed power problem. That's a class design issue, and again something that I feel when you talk about the evils of borrowed power and why borrowed power equals bad, you're kind of missing, like you're talking about the symptom, but you're not talking about the cause, because that's clearly, in my eyes, a class design problem.
I agree. It's so often it's so often the case with really any issue. And I think the kind of what we set out to do with the show, which is let's actually drill down and talk about the different parts, and not every voice on a given issue looks at the other side or looks at individual cases, because from class to class it's different, which is what you're pointing out. But yeah, even like my TLDR and all of this is like, no, it's not inherently bad. Like I have really fond memories of Legion, and a major portion of that was the borrowed power system of artifact weapons. It's because it was good that I like it. Like, it's because it worked. It turns out when things are good, you have a rosier memory.
Well, I think actually, just while it pops into my head, and I do apologize for interrupting, but I think actually with the example I just made, where borrowed power is bad when it fills gaps that in a spec which shouldn't be there. Like, there's actually an argument that Legion, where we all agree, like it kind of worked. There's an argument that's actually the most egregious example of that, because specs were literally designed in Legion to work around the artifact ability. Like the artifact abilities, because there was no way you weren't going to have the main artifact ability. Like every discipline priest was going to have Light's Wrath, which was the central tentpole ability to that spec, and the entire way the spec was designed. Same with like Shadow Priest and like other, like numerous other specs as well. Like those specs were specifically designed around the borrowed power of the artifact. Like they didn't work without them. Like everything in the first iteration of Discipline Priest in Legion, I'm just using that as an example because it's a good example and it's one of the ones I know best, was designed around ability, was tied to the artifact that wasn't going to be there next expansion. And in lots of cases, we saw them then get baked into talents or sometimes into the actual spec itself. Light's Wrath didn't, by the way. That just completely disappeared, and it's no longer a part of the Discipline Priest toolkit. But it was a really important part of the Legion rotation. And lots of people think that the spec is poorer for not having it. But I mean, those, just to go kind of against what I just said, those all Legion specs were designed around a borrowed ability. And it was ability that you were given straight up without having to really earn it, beyond doing a short artifact quest line that you couldn't progress in the rest of the expansion without doing anyway. And you had it, no questions asked for the entire expansion, but then you used it. And maybe that's one of the reasons BFA felt so bad, was because you lost, and because the specs stayed pretty much the same for the most part, like they will in Shadowlands. The specs stayed more or less the same from BFA to from Legion to BFA. Specs and classes underwent probably the biggest overall change that they've ever had, going from WoD to Legion. And they stayed much more similar going into BFA, but nearly every single spec had a lot, and spec, not even class, because every spec had an artifact weapon with a tentpole ability. Every single spec lost an ability that in most cases, the entire rotation of that spec was built around. And it's not that you suddenly got depowered or anything like that. It's that you played a class whose tentpole ability had now become maybe a talent if you were lucky, or had disappeared completely. And that felt really odd and really bad. And it is a class design problem. And I can see why they made those decisions in Legion. They just thought, look, WoD isn't a good expansion. We need something really good in Legion. So, the expansion after Legion, give a fuck. Let's just make this as fun as we possibly can right now. And that's the price they paid. The price they paid for making Legion that flat out fun and interesting in regards to their specs and the artifact power and rotation. They had to pay that price in BFA. They made that deal. They were like, we just need Legion to be as good as possible and feel as good as possible, because this game could literally die if this expansion is as bad as WoD. It was one more piece to the extreme focus on class fantasy too. I mean, the Legion and class halls and all of that. Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. And I can see why they made those decisions, and I think it was probably the right thing to do. But it did mean that there was a price to pay the next expansion, BFA. I mean, I still have Wake of Ashes on my Ret Paladin. I don't know what you're complaining about. But you still have to choose it as a talent, right? In Shadowlands, of course, it is a baseline ability, by the way, Wake of Ashes, which feels great. As is the Fire Mage artifact ability, after being a talent in BFA, is now in Shadowlands being made baseline. And I feel like these are things that should have happened in BFA, and didn't. And yeah, so I mean, and again, that is a problem that is most easy to describe and notice in terms of borrowed power and the issues with borrowed power. But again, I would argue that actually they're class design problems, right? Yeah, and Shadowrun's kind of talk about this, and this has been rattling around my head this entire episode as you've been drilling deeper down into the more egregious cases of what's problematic about borrowed power comes down to class designs or holes in class design. Why don't they make more adjustments to classes in patches? Well, I find it very odd. I don't play a shaman, so I hesitate to bring it up because I can only speak to it from, third party, reading forums and whatnot. Tell you why they say they don't? Sure. Do you want me to literally answer that question? Sure. Go ahead and be a. I want to make it very clear, because I know what people who listen to podcasts are like. This isn't a defense, okay? This is just the answer that they would give you if they asked you this question, if you asked them this question. And they would say that once a patch is live, people have made decisions based on the way classes are, particularly going into raiding and Mythic Plus and things like that. Particularly raid and high-end raiding, where these days raids release maybe a couple of weeks after the patch goes live. So they usually give themselves those 2 weeks to make alterations. But after those 2 weeks, once the raid goes live, they try very specifically not to make class changes then until the next tier. And the reason for that is because people have made their choices. People have made their decisions going into the tier of raiding, and more alteration would, like if a class is trash going into the raid, people know it is. Okay, so they can stay away from it. And so it like changing the meta once like the world first race is in full, or they would say they don't take the world first race into account, but once like cutting edge guilds are kind of starting to push and things like that, they would say that making big class changes, even if it's to fix a broken class, would cause more problems than it would solve. That's the answer they would give to you. Whether or not you agree with that is up to you.
I can hear the sound of booze from BlizzCon. Yeah, that's I just so disagree with that on a base level.
Well, so do I. I want to make it clear, but that's the argument they would give you.
Yeah, and I'm just here to say they're wrong, like really wrong. It sucks. Like it feels like such a cop out. Like, hey, y'all got this spec wrong. It's unplayable. It's crap. Can we please fix it? Well, no, you've already made your decision. Like that just to me feels like the cop out of the century for this game.
Yeah, I would. I obviously I can understand their reasoning, and I can understand that argument. And obviously they would probably explain that and make it sound a lot more reasonable than I can, because they actually know what they're talking about.
I don't know. That sounds like a pretty on brand answer. For the WoW devs.
So I'd also like to bring up, just for the sake of balance, I'd like to bring up, an example where borrowed power has, in my opinion, made the game much, much better in the long term. And I would like to bring up Glimmer of Light. So Glimmer of Light playstyle, which is an ability that originated in Artifact Power as an Artifact Power and didn't even come into its own, didn't even become a thing until like 8.1 or 2. But when it did become a thing, completely changed the playstyle of Holy Paladins for the better and made it one of the most fun specs in the game. Kind of by accident, in a way. It was just an ability that arrived in the form of an azerite trait, and it was really good, and people really enjoyed it, and is now baseline or a talent in going into Shadowlands, which is an example. Like I said, I'm just doing this for balance, but it's an example of that system bearing some really quite tasty fruit in the case of Holy Paladin and the Glimmer playstyle. And I'm glad, because, chances are if you didn't have the borrowed power system of azerite, then Glimmer wouldn't have happened, and we wouldn't be looking at this really fun playstyle for Holy Paladins. There's examples you can use where similar things have happened with Mistweaver Monk as well, and other specs as well. And when I think the argument is that if during the course of introducing borrowed power, something defines itself as being like a massive improvement on the spec to the extent where you don't want to lose it, Blizzard, you don't have to lose the power from borrowed power. Like if it turns out really good and everyone likes it, and you think it would be beneficial to keep it in the spec, Blizzard have proven that they are more than willing to do that. They people went, Glimmer is brilliant and we really enjoy playing Glimmer. Blizz didn't turn around and go, well, fuck you, because it's azerite armor and it's borrowed power, so you're going to lose it in Shadowlands. Sorry, get over it. They didn't do that. They went, yeah, you're right, it is really good. It's now part of the spec. So and borrowed power doesn't always have to be borrowed. It could be an introduction to something that will stay with your spec.
Right. There's systems that are at the end of the day, they're like petri dishes. They're playgrounds for the developers to mess around with new things, and they have shown they showed it with abilities from artifacts, and they're showing it again, Glimmer of Light, with BFA systems, that they're willing to keep things. And so again, I think it really comes down to an ability by ability, a class by class, a spec by spec case of if you like it or not. Because at the end of the day, it's up to the devs, and they are going to curate what lives beyond the system that is outgoing. And sometimes going to make correct decisions, and sometimes going to make incorrect decisions, and there's going to be both good and bad decisions made within the same expansion, like as it move into the next, because you might be sad that certain things are lost, and you might be stoked that certain things are kept, and vice versa.
I really like the idea, the way you put it, as being a petri dish. Yeah, and because if they didn't have the means to kind of try these things out with the safety of it being a borrowed ability, like and it not being a permanent change to the balance of a class, but like a on the face of it temporary thing, then I wonder how many less risks they take with stuff that then turned out to be good. And yeah, we have a lot of misfires and we have a lot of failures for sure, but there are examples where being able to just throw out some ideas in the middle of an expansion just because it's part of some borrowed power system has kind of like improved specs in the long run and solved problems in specs as well, and just made them more fun. And that's good. Am I saying that is outweighing any of the bad that you might feel about like borrowed power systems in general, or holes in specs that were maybe left there for? I still don't know if like the holes in the specs in BFA were there specifically so that Azerite armor had some holes to fill. I'm not sure if that was the design philosophy. Blizzard say it wasn't, but of course they would say that. But I mean, I just don't know if it was or not. My gut says probably not, and people don't like some of the specs in BFA, so they blame Azerite for forcing the spec to be bad, so that Azerite had some things had some holes to fill. I'm just not sure if that's how it worked, but
yeah, I think the answer to that, like the true answer that we'll never get, is kind of irrelevant, because really you're just trying to figure out how mad you should be. When in reality, it's just like, is the spec good or bad? To me, that's it. Is it good or bad? Is the spec absolutely unplayable and useless? That's bad, and Blizzard should do something about it, and they're really reluctant to, in my opinion. It's an online game. Patch the damn thing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't... Oh, God, yeah. And I know that they say they don't take Wasted World first into account. It sure does seem like they do, and I don't want them to. I don't care what the, like, 0.05% top of the player base, like, I'm sorry. Like, that's not the majority of WoW players.
Yeah. I mean, there's also an argument that the Race to World First is the biggest single esport event that Blizzard have across all their IPs at the moment. So you can see why they like it.
Well, I mean, do you want to go down a rabbit hole of why they should probably pay a little more attention and care to some of their other esports?
Not really.
Cool.
How's
what?
I hear it's in a really good place, though, Heroes. So,
Heroes is great. Heroes is fantastic. No, I was thinking more Hearthstone, where you want to talk about RNG killing an esport, in my opinion.
Hey, listen, man, all I remember about Hearthstone is when I played it once for a month because I got a Hearthstone mount in WoW. And even in the training scenario, when Uther was there telling me how to play Hearthstone, I was like, cheers, Uther, this is great. I'm having time. Like one of the points, one of the points they made, I think it was Uther. I know he does it in Heroes.
He does it in Heroes, yeah.
Yeah, whatever the training was in Hearthstone. And they were like... literally one of the first things it told you when you were training in Hearthstone was, this game is not balanced. Like, it made a joke out of it, but it was like, this game is not balanced. It is one of the text boxes that came up in your very early training was, this game was not balanced. And that's one of the things I really liked about it. And yes, obviously when the game becomes more serious and people are spending more money on it, it must have been the Innkeeper. And like, obviously you're selling it as an esport and things like that. You have to balance it. But I always remember how delighted I was by that text box when it popped up when I was learning Hearthstone, because this game is not balanced. And it was like a kind of a get over it thing, Mm-hmm. It was like, and I just thought that was wonderful and I liked it a lot. But then I'm someone who played Hearthstone for a month of my entire life, so my opinion is just not important. Nor would I pretend that it is.
Yeah. So was this a really long-winded way to say, is borrowed power good or bad? Our answer is, it depends.
Maybe, yeah. Okay, so listen, I've talked about this before, but I think genuinely, I mean, the issues with BFA are well documented on this channel and beyond. And particularly with azerite armor, which I still contend is the problem that is not only the biggest problem of BFA, but also probably causes most of the other problems in BFA as well, indirectly. So like it's that bad. And that's a shame, isn't it? So what I'm saying is, if Blizzard had taken my idea, it was my idea of how to replace artifact weapons, because like we've said here, that was always the question all the way through Legion was, what happens to our artifact weapons? More importantly, that's like the lore question. More importantly, from a gameplay point of view, what replaces them? And with the success of Legion, and this is something that you forget now, where one of the main criticisms of BFA is that it's essentially like Legion 2.0, but maybe not quite as good. It's almost hard to remember now, but before BFA was announced, and when we were at that stage in Legion where the expansion had been a tremendous success, and like so many new things had been introduced that we all wanted to see stay, like world quests, which whatever you think of what they've become, were a massive improvement, in my opinion, on what came before. And emissaries and Mythic Plus, and the kind of the structure that the expansion took. And like so many people were saying, look, you know what? If the next expansion is just like Legion 2.0, we would be fine with that. You know, like we kind of hope it is, because like Blizz have struck gold with Legion, and we want them to carry all of this on and like just iterate on it, but not kind of revolutionize any of it.
I mean, it's what I and a lot of my friends thought BFA was going to be.
Yeah, and kind of is. And like BFA is almost a kind of a be careful what you wish for kind of thing, because it kind of is. They tried to iterate on the artifact weapon with azerite power, didn't work. But like it's very much an iteration on a Legion system rather than a new system, really. You know, obviously Mythic Plus and emissaries and all of that kind of stayed in the game. The only like things they introduced into BFA, which are totally new, are things that don't really affect the game at all, like island expeditions and war fronts, which, okay, didn't work, but the game isn't like worse for them not working, because the game wouldn't have been that much better for them working, because they were like irrelevant things. They were just like little side activities. The main kind of structural things about the expansion were taken straight from Legion, which is what we all wanted them to do. But when they did it, it didn't really work, and they shouldn't have done it. In hindsight, they should have had the courage to just like, as it looks like they're kind of doing in Shadowlands, you know, not just do what they were told. They should have had the courage to just go and like have completely new ideas, which is how we got Legion in the first place.
And there were unpopular systems in Legion as well. Wither training anybody? God, I could just erase that from Legion entirely, and it wouldn't have bothered me.
Hated that. Hated Wither training so much. I still hate it now. It still makes me angry to think about.
They made me hate Suramar. Like something that the first time I saw it blew my mind, and I truly loved it. And I'm the biggest elf fanboy you'll ever meet. But just like the whole, like everything on Suramar just kind of rubbed me the wrong way.
Well, I just didn't engage with it in any way. I did it once and I was like, wow, that's rubbish. I never did it again. And I was like, and I know how it's going to change. And I know how it's going to progress. And like, you know, I don't need to do this again. I didn't find it fun. So I didn't care. Like in the same way with Island Expeditions, I was like, well, these are fine, but I don't really like them. So I'll do 3 a week that I have to do to stay up with my azerite.
Yeah.
And that'll be that.
Yeah.
And I did my 3 a week. And I actually looked forward to doing my 3 a week because it took me 20 minutes. And it was a nice little fun diversion for 20 minutes every week. And so like, you know, because I never had to farm that stuff, because I never had to do hundreds a day to get my azerite power up, the game is better for islands being in the game than not being in the game as far as I'm concerned, because I didn't have to like min-max that stuff, because I'm very good at completely ignoring gameplay that I don't like. Which is maybe why I like this game better than a whole lot of other people. So my point is that going into BFA, we all knew that Blizzard were going to replace artifact weapons, which people generally really liked, with another system a bit like artifact weapons, which is exactly what they did. And so my question was, like in Legion, what was the best way to do that? And I still think my idea that I came up with, and I don't want to toot my own horn here, but I still think my idea was vastly superior to azerite armor in every way. And my idea that I came up with like halfway through Legion was a crafted artifact weapon. So you began the expansion because like an artifact weapon was great, but it was like everyone enjoyed it, but obviously you'd have to replace it next expansion. So what about keeping all the fun stuff about an artifact weapon, but having it be something that would follow you through the expansions? So this idea of borrowed power wasn't an issue because like you were going to make this weapon and that was going to be your weapon forever. Now bear with me. So at the beginning of the expansion, they're like, oh, she had to get rid of our artifact weapons, but don't worry, hero who's just lost the Ashbringer and now you're going to have to use a Kultiran shit sword for a little bit. No.
Got barnacles on it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, here, never mind, you lost the Ashbringer. That's a shame. Here is a green Kultiris shit sword. Have fun, adventurer. Go and do the raid with that. And I was like, okay, well, how about Magni's like, such a shame, champion. You lost your artifact weapon. That was pretty baller. Well, never mind. Let's make you a new one and we'll create our own history with this weapon. And so you go to the forge and you create your weapon. And, you know, you got some basic visual options that you can give to it, depending on what kind of weapon it is, just to start off with. And it kind of, my idea was that it would kind of work like a combination of the artifact weapon and what essences later became as well. So it had slots in it that you would unlock. And a very important part of this, by the way, is that you get to name your own weapon as well. This is like, and I know people think this is just like a jokey bit that I put into this idea, but no, it's very, very important that you get to name your own weapon because this is going to become a part of your character. Because one of the things I really liked about BFA, Legion and the artifact weapons was how close I started feeling to my artifact weapons and how much I kind of like, you know, like the bond and the link that I felt with them. I thought I was going to hate having one weapon from the entire expansion, but I actually loved it. And I was very sad to see them go. So you have like your own crafted artifact and you level it up through the expansion, putting like power into it like you did the artifact weapon. That would unlock slots, and those slots would work like kind of talent slots, and you collect talents either through crafting or through doing things like you would to gain essences or by killing bosses and stuff like that, and you could kind of swap them out and they become part of your weapon. But also one of the things you'd be collecting by doing like raids and things like that would be extra kind of visual options for them as well, that you could kind of, you know, like, so you would still have weapon drops, but there'd be weapon transmog drops that you could then like have in your catalog of being able to change like the look of your weapon and things like that. And that'd also be something that crafting could do as well. So crafters could make hilts or blades or like, you know, bowstrings or like arrow effects or things like that, which would apply to your weapon as well. So it would be this thing that you take from expansion to expansion, and maybe like the kind of essence effects that you got to put into the slots would have an item level. So it would kind of work like tier set bonuses and things like that, where, you know, you didn't necessarily want to lose the effect and you still kind of got it, but you're going to want to swap it out just because like the item level isn't high enough anymore, and you need to replace it with one from the current raid and stuff to really keep yourself kind of like max power and stuff like that. So that's a way that you would be continuing to like add it. You wouldn't have to keep adding slots. You just like replace the things that you put in those slots throughout the expansions, and like kind of like gradually add to the overall power of it and the item level by adding to the power with like artifact power and stuff like that. And so then you'd have this thing which would follow you from expansion to expansion, and it'd be your weapon which you made and which you named, and which like eventually gains this kind of legendary status as much as the Ashbringer or something, because eventually, like, you know, if they'd done this at the beginning of BFA, this is already the weapon that killed N'Zoth. Like, this is already like the weapon that defeated Ashara. You know, like you create this storied history for a weapon automatically, and maybe there's like a history book that goes with your weapon as well, like you got in the order halls, which is like the history of Taliesin's law, and it's like then Taliesin's law was used to defeat Ashara, and like chapters are added to the history of your weapon as you complete raids and defeat baddies and things like that. I just think it'd be awesome. I just think it'd be really, really good, and it was better than Azerite armor, is all I'm saying.
I mean, that's not a high bar, but
and think about it. You can even like let's apply it going into Shadowlands. Let's say you'd had this system throughout BFA, and then you go into Shadowlands, and instead of like the Covenants being like, "Hey, I can give you this ability," they can go, "Hey, I can empower your artifact weapon with this ability." like if you join our covenant. So like it's all linked and it all like feeds into this artifact weapon. So this is like your progression system that kind of follows you. So like these powers don't feel borrowed. They feel like they're just passing through your weapon sort of thing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, like I'm not as concerned with like what the lore impetus is for whatever the next system is. I just want it to be less convoluted and terrible than the Azerite system was, because I thought when they initially announced Azerite and the necklace, I'm like, oh cool, the necklace we're just going to click talents through the necklace like we do in the artifact weapon, and we're just moving forward with this concept as this is what progression in World of Warcraft looks like. Sweet, I'm on board. And then I'm like, wait, what the shit is armor? Like, what is this? Why is this? You know, they tried something new. It didn't work, but unfortunately it stuck around for the entire damn expansion. And so, yeah, like, I think your idea is awesome. Like, I sound super into that, and I share a lot of the same feelings that you do. I thought I was absolutely going to hate the fact that I wasn't looting new weapons through raid progression, through dungeons, and the like. But it didn't. I ended up really liking my my artifact weapon. Fortunately, it was DK, and I don't like Frost anymore, and so I never go back and visit it. But that's neither here nor there. Like, really, I just expected that system to carry forward more directly.
Yeah.
Like, whether it sticks with the weapon or not, I was kind of expecting that system to work as the necklace system, and it didn't.
Yeah. So, and like the reason I made it a weapon was because it's like it was clear when we were thinking about what would replace an artifact weapon is like the weapon is the best example of this system. Like you can move it to armor, but having like a similar system on gloves, or as it turned out, helm and shoulders and chest, just is never going to be as satisfying as having it on a weapon. Because like these kind
it
of
could be if it was one thing that you didn't replace. The reason that I think the armor
like
is so painful
you from expansion to expansion is something that you don't replace. So like the system is always connected to your weapon. So again, there's less of a feeling of one system getting replaced by another system like halfway through expansion, because it's always the crafted artifact weapon. And like you can make little changes to that as expansions go on and things like that, but it stays this thing that you created in that expansion and that has followed you ever since.
It's cool, but it's also a wrapper at the end of the day, because like if the system worked exactly the same and it was just a different slot, who cares?
I think a lot of gearing is psychological, and a lot of the satisfaction you get from gearing is psychological. And I think the way that Mythic Plus works now is a really good example of that. The way that, you know, on the face of it, you're just doing what you've always done. A new tier releases and you try and get better gear to replace your old gear. Okay, that's what you're doing when you're running Mythic Plus and a new season. But because that psychologically you're actually aiming for the same gear again with the same name, just at a higher item level. Now, really, that's just the wrapper, you know. But the psychological effect is much, much worse. That gear has the same name and drops from the same boss and is essentially the same gear, but at a higher item level. Like they got the wrapper wrong. And that's why, like, gearing every new tier in Mythic Plus is so unsatisfying. Like, and the way you solve that is to change the wrapper. Like, you just need to change the name of the gear and swap which boss it's from, and like make it look different. It's the wrapper that needs changing, and it's the wrapper which is so unsatisfying. So I would argue that actually the wrapper is incredibly important.
It is I'm arguing it's somewhat important, because I think Azerite armor at its core is flawed. And I don't want to keep it around. I don't think there's merit to it. I think it should be done away with. Even if they did add unique armor appearances, it would help. But I don't like Azerite armor traits. Like, let's just get rid of them.
Oh, sure. For sure.
But my point more to your pitching of the, like, keep the weapon around was if they had just take the system you described and it was on the necklace, it would have been a massive improvement. And it wouldn't have necessarily mattered if it was a weapon or a necklace. I think personally, the weapon is cooler. I'm with you.
I think, yeah. I mean, maybe in the grand scheme, it wouldn't have mattered from a gameplay point of view, but from just a point of view of how fun it is, the weapon is clearly the most fun option.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even show off our necklace, which is another like negative,
Well,
or another check
because
mark in
visual-
the negative.
because
column.
collecting visual appearances for it would be an important part of the system. Like, you know, and weapons are one of the most satisfying things to collect visual appearances from. Like, look at the Mage Tower. Would the Mage Tower have been so successful if you got a helm appearance from it, or if you got a cloak appearance from it? No way. Like, one of the really engaging things about Mage Tower was you got a unique weapon appearance from it, and that was something very, very special.
I think
and any other type of appearance.
The only other slot that I think could give it a run for its money is shoulders.
Perhaps, but then shoulders, you always need to match like the helm and the rest of it. Like the weapon exists in its own vacuum and it's its own thing. Whereas like if you just had shoulders, you're like, well, okay, it needs to match the rest of the transmog, stuff like that. Like a weapon is its own island in a way that no other gear slot is.
That is fair, but also because of appearances, you could combat that somewhat and offer appearances as new looks roll out through different, tiers.
Yeah, no, I agree. But there's just also something incredibly fantasy. Like you don't, when you're playing Zelda, you don't come into a clearing in like the magical forest and see some shoulders embedded in the ground with light shining down on them that you then pick up. Like it's a sword. Okay.
That's right. You're talking about Link, who doesn't even, who has no respect for pauldrons because he's never worn pauldrons. He doesn't understand how.
King Arthur is not the helm in the stone, is it? Okay, it's the sword in the stone. All right, like these things are weapons. These are like it's a thing about fantasy. Like the weapon is very emblematic of a character. Like characters in fantasy are often named after their weapon, like their nickname or something, and like it's very important. Like and it's obvious to see why, because it's the most like obvious part of like the toolkit that a character wields most of the time. The one exception I can really think of is the ring in Lord of the Rings. But like you don't even see your rings on your character. And we've had a legendary ring in WoW and it was shit. So, I mean, like, yeah, like the weapon is just that obvious thing. Like the weapon is the thing that when Bilbo picks it up, he names it Sting, okay? He doesn't pick up his helm and name it anything. Like he picks up his sword. Like the weapon is the thing that you give the name. And like, that's what
Taliesin. Taliesin, what do you have an entire second account to save a lockout in a raid for farming? Is it for a weapon? Remind me, Taliesin.
You're right, it's shoulders, but goddamn, if there was a weapon that looked like that, I'd be going for it.
I will die on the shoulder hill. This is World of Warcraft, damn it. The only thing we care about are shoulders and chainmail bikinis. That's what we're here for. That's why we're grinding.
Fair. I would say the only thing that comes close to defining fantasy characters as the weapon they use is maybe the mount that they ride.
Yes.
But apart from that, it's always the weapon. It's never the shoulders. It's never the helm. And that would just fit in that like just ethos. Like, you've crafted this and it's your weapon and it becomes like the thing that symbolizes your character. And I really liked how artifact weapons symbolized my character in Legion. And so that's why I, wanted it to be the weapon that you kind of took from expansion to expansion. Just because that seems more symbolic and satisfying than taking shoulders from expansion to expansion. It just seemed like the obvious thing. And I would argue that azerite armor has proved that it's not as fun as weapons. And like, it just isn't as satisfying because it's not.
Nope. There goes the internet. Do I still have chat room? F in chat for Tally's internet. Let's do this. Let's do a disconnect. And try rejoining. Yeah.
Did I just? Yeah.
You did this. You completely froze up. Your video's off.
I just unplugged my video and back. What was the last? It was a brilliant point, and it basically solved the argument. It basically won any argument we might have been having. And you can just bear that in mind. Wait a minute, I'll just click my.
Well, hold on, because I stopped the audio recording to make this easier for myself to clean up for the audio listeners.
All right, sorry. I should be back on now. My Discord is now working, and the video is working on my Discord. So I'm just
you're
not
a giant purple box with a tiny little Maurice inside the center.
Hey, could be worse. Could be worse.
There you go.
There we are.
There it is. All right, let me play this back real fast. Where'd you leave off? Oh,
sorry, everyone.
Let's see.
I was just talking away, and then I saw lots of Fs pop up in chat.
You were wrapping it up, saying that you really think that weapons are just more satisfying than azerite.
Yeah, I mean that was basically it. They're just more satisfying, in my opinion. And I think if you were going to have like an item that was tied to a system that was going to follow you from expansion to expansion, I just think like the weapon is the easiest sell, personally.
I really can't argue with that. I really just want to make a point that, you know, if the system was good, we'd all be happier. But yeah, weapons are freaking cool.
Yeah. But I would also argue if you put the artifact weapon system, the exact same system, into shoulders, like if Legion had been the artifact shoulders system or the artifact helm system, it just wouldn't have been as fun, even if it had been the exact same system. Because, you know, when you did your artifact ability, it wouldn't have been you holding your cool artifact weapon up in that cool pose.
Yeah, it would have been me flexing like a total boss. Like, yeah, look at this.
I'm just saying it would have been less fun had it not been the weapon, even if it had been the exact same system, in my opinion.
I'm still gonna die on this hill. This hill, by the way, is a single orc shoulder.
It's two shoulders, but yes, you're right. And I do have a slight obsession with the Tusks of Manaroth, which is the drop from Garrosh in Siege of Orgrimmar. But one of the obsessions I have with the Tusks of Manaroth is just because they are very difficult to get. And they're one of the few things in the game at the moment where transmog-wise, people recognize them as being a big achievement. The other thing would be like gladiator sets. But I'm not good enough to get a gladiator set, whereas I can just work really hard and get the Tusks of Manaroth. And like you see someone wearing Tusks of Manaroth, you know how hard those are to get and you recognize them immediately. So that's part of the appeal with that. Same as like that's part of the appeal with my glorious hippo. People, it's one of the few things in game now that you can see and you know what someone has done to get it. Like you look at the hippo and you go, oh cool, that guy did some PvP and had to get a certain rating to get that hippo and then earn it at that rating, sort of thing.
Murder some fools.
Yeah, had to murder some fools, and it's likely that guy had to do some serious hardcore farming to get those tusks.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the things I like. I like things where the achievement that you completed to get the thing is recognizable by like someone just passing you in the street in the game, you know. So that's one of the appeals of the Tusks of Manaroth. But yeah.
Well, as we wind down here, I want to thank Sheep again for writing in to wowkillercast@gmail.com for being the entire reason we had this 90-minute conversation.
Yeah, I'm surprised we managed to talk about it this long, to be perfectly honest with you. But it just shows like what an interesting subject it's turned out to be.
It brings to light other talking points. Like we even got into why aren't there more micro adjustments to classes and patches across BFA, and that's it's kind of tied up in this package of this topic. So thanks, Sheep, and folks, if you want to write in either with a kind of a one-off question for our mailbag episodes or an actual topic you would like to pitch as a future episode of WoW Killers, send them to wowkillercast@gmail.com. That's right, we're asking you to write the show for us.
That'd be really good, actually.
Before we go, Taliesin, if folks are somehow unaware of the wonderful WoW content that you are putting out into the world, where can folks find you?
You can find us at Taliesin and Evitel Do Games on YouTube. You can find us here on Twitch at Taliesin and Evitel. And you can find us on Twitter at Taliesin and Evitel as well, where we only talk about WoW. That's all we talk about on our Twitter. So, like, if you want some cool WoW tweets and only that, come and join us on Twitter.
You can find me at Garrett Art on Twitter. Everything I produce, this podcast included, can be found over at amove.tv. Check out The Angry Chicken for Hearthstone. Check out Into the Nexus for Heroes of the Storm. Yes, that game is still going.
And don't forget the Hungry for Dick Chicken.
The Dick Hungry Chicken.
The Dick Hungry Chicken. I'd forgotten.
DHC. I apologize to anyone listening to this episode with children.
No, are you kidding? We just gave children good advice. Don't run around chickens with your willy out. That's good advice. What are you talking about? Kids, don't listen to Garrett. Listen to me. Kids,
Also, goats.
don't run around chickens with your willy out.
Just at farms in general. I don't be around
And especially
agriculture
not
nude.
dick-hungry chickens. If you must run around chickens with your willy out, make sure they're not dick-hungry chickens.
Advice
If
we
you
can
must
all
run
live
around
by.
chickens with your dick out, make sure they've already eaten some dicks that day. Make sure they are dick-sated chickens. That's my advice.
I have no outro.
I must tell my son that advice right now.
I'm going to cut before that follow-up and just fade out to music on the audio podcast. That's how the show ends. That's how this episode ends. Oh, Christ. Oh, that was goofy.
I think far from killing WoW, I think we pretty much saved WoW, right?
I mean, I think it's kind of the joke of the show is that we are legitimately trying to debunk a lot of extreme vitriol.
Yeah. Yeah. Patrick's in the chat. Hello, Patrick.
Or just have a sane conversation.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I showed up for this. You're damn right you did, Patrick.
Good advice for your children, Patrick, for your child.
I mean, someone might call a dick hungry chicken a cock gobbler. Just saying. Someone might call him that.
There's something very visceral about the dick hungry chicken.
I get the sensation of pain every time you say it.
Yeah.
I can't believe you
children the dick hungry chicken's here.
I mean, I guess I can believe it, but I also sometimes I can't believe you told that story on the show. I was like,
poor old Jake.
I was like,
if that really is his name, which it is.
It was that was pure selfishness on my own part because you're like, oh, I told you about Jake. I'm like, and I almost said yes just to keep ourselves on topic, but I really wanted to know what the story was.
So it's kind of your fault.
It is. Listen, it's our show. Folks can deal.
Well, I'm going to go and have a look at a new flat in a bit. So I might have time to stream like for an hour or so on my own channel after this. But then I'm going to run and look at a new flat. I was saying this to Garrett before. We're looking for a 3-bedroom flat at the moment. Like we're in a 2-bedroom one now, but obviously one room is an office, one room me and Evie sleep in, and we'd like a room for Annie to sleep in when he's a little bit bigger, and just a bit more space to run around in. But like everywhere that we're looking at the moment, which is 3 bedrooms, it's not really an extra room. It's just like an extra wall. Like the space is exactly the same. They just put an extra wall in, and they're gone. There you go. It's got this place has got one more room.
Maybe
it's
2 extra walls because they want a corner instead of a wedge.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it sucks, man. It's hard.
Chat, y'all, as usual, have been great, hilarious, and thought-provoking. Thank you for hanging out. I'm going to bring the stream down now, so bye.
Bye.